I just found out right now, this moment, a very important thing. And that is, it is Storytime with Uncle Scotty. And I am your host, Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs. Very full of water. Hydration is important. Also important, washing our hands. Also important, washing our spectacles. Make sure that we can see clearly. Eh? That's what they say in Canada. Hi, Donna. We've been reading Pippi Longstocking. And oh my goodness, what a character Pippi is. She really is just model citizen. I mean, people try to break into her house and steal her things. Instead, she ties them up, convinces them to dance with her and play music all night. And then when they're finished with that, she makes them this beautiful feast. And after that, she bids them farewell and she gives them money and say that they earned it honestly. So she not only saved herself and the town, she also taught them a lesson. Maybe changed their life. How beautiful is that? Shout out to Pippi. More people need to be like Pippi. I need to be more like Pippi. Starting with extra big shoes. A? Okay, that's 2 A's already in this episode, if you're counting at home, which I hope you are. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? I think this is a big chapter, so let's strap in and get ready for this ride. Chapter 9, Pippi goes to a coffee party. Chapter 9, Pippi goes to a coffee party. Chapter 9, Pippi goes to a coffee party. Shall I start? Okay, I'll start. Tommy's and Annika's mother had invited a few ladies to a coffee party, and as she had done plenty of baking, she thought Tommy and Annika might invite Pippi over at the same time. The children would entertain each other and give no trouble to anyone. We'll see. Tommy and Annika were overjoyed when their mother told them and immediately dashed over to Pippi's to invite her. Pippi was in the garden, watering the few flowers still in bloom with an old rusty watering can. As it was raining cats and dogs that day, Tommy told Pippi her watering seemed hardly necessary. Yes, that's what you say, said Pippi grudgingly, but I've lain awake all night thinking what fun it was going to be to get up and water, and I'm not going to let a little rain stand in my way. Now Annika came forth with the delighted news about the coffee party. A coffee party? Me? Cried Pippi. And she was so excited that she began to water Tommy instead of the rose bush that she had intended to sprinkle. Shh. Oh, what will happen? I'm so nervous. What if I can't behave myself? Of course you can, said Annika. Don't you be too certain about that, said Pippi. You can be sure I'll try, but I've noticed several times that people don't think I know how to behave, even when I'm trying as hard as I can. At sea, we were never so fussy about things like that. But I promise I'll take special pains today so that you won't have to be ashamed of me. Good, said Tommy, and he and Annika hurried home again in the rain. This afternoon, 3 o'clock, ding, don't forget, cried Annika, peeking out from under the umbrella. At 3 o'clock, a very stylish young lady walked up the steps of the Settergrens' house. That must be Tommy and Annika's house, the Settergrens. It was Pippi Longstocking. For this special occasion, she had unbraided her pigtails, and her red hair hung like a lion's mane around her. With red crayon, she had painted her mouth fiery red, and she had blackened her eyebrows so that she almost looked dangerous. With the crayon, she had also painted her fingernails, and she had put big green rosettes on her shoes. I don't know what rosettes are. Maybe some sort of flower? I would say a rosette is a small flower, but they're big and green. Don't know. We'll see. I should imagine I'll be the most stylish person at this party, she said contentedly to herself as she rang the doorbell. In the Settergrens' living room sat 3 fine ladies, and with them Tommy, Annika, and their mother. A wonderful coffee table had been spread, and in the fireplace a fire was burning brightly. The ladies were talking quietly with one another, and Tommy and Annika were sitting on the sofa looking at an album. Everything was so peaceful. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. Attention! A piercing cry came from the hall, and the next minute Pippi Longstocking stood in the doorway. She had cried out so loudly and so unexpectedly that the ladies had jumped in their seats. Forward march! Cried the next command, and Pippi, with measured steps, walked up to Mrs. Settergren. Halt! She stopped. Arms forward! 1, 2! She cried, and with both hands gripped one of Mrs. Settergren's and shook it heartily. Knees bend! She shrieked and curtsied prettily. Then she smiled at Mrs. Settergren and said in her ordinary voice, You see, I am really very shy, so if I don't give myself some commands, I'll just stand in the hall and not dare to come in." Then she rushed up to the other ladies and gave them a kiss on the cheek. "Charming, charming, upon my honor," she said, for she had once heard a stylish gentleman say that to a lady. Then she sat down in the best chair she could find. Mrs. Settergren had intended for the children to have their party up in Tommy and Annika's room, but Pippi stayed calmly in her chair, slapped herself on the knee, and said, looking at the coffee table, "That certainly looks good. When do we begin?" At that moment, Ella, the maid, came in with a coffee pot, and Mrs. Settergren said, "Please, come and have some coffee. Please, come and have some coffee." "First!" cried Pippi, and was up by the table in 2 skips. She heaped as many cakes as she could onto a plate, threw 5 lumps of sugar into a coffee cup, emptied half the cream from the pitcher into her cup, and was back in her chair with her lute before the ladies had even reached the table. Pippi stretched her legs out in front of her and placed the plate of cakes between her toes. Then she merrily clunked cakes in her coffee cup and stuffed so many in her mouth at once that she couldn't have uttered a word no matter how hard she tried. So with her feet? What? Place the plate. Oh, the plate of cakes is between her toes. She's taken the cakes, dunking them in her coffee, and stuffing them in her mouth. In the twinkling of an eye, she had finished all the cakes on her plate. She got up, struck the plate as if it were a tambourine, and went up to the table to see if there were any cakes left. The ladies looked disapprovingly at her, but that didn't bother her. Chatting gaily, she walked along the table, snatching a cake here and there. "Oh, hello. Oh, hello. All this cake eating's making me thirsty." "It was certainly nice of you to invite me," she said. "I've never been to a coffee party before." On the table stood a large cream pie, decorated in the center with a piece of red candy. Pippi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at it. Suddenly, she bent down and snatched the candy with her teeth. But she dived down a little too hastily, and when she came up again, her whole face was covered with whipped cream, like Mrs. Doubtfire. "Goody!" laughed Pippi. "Now we can play blind man's buff, for we've certainly got a blind man all made to order. I can't see a thing." I think there must be a game of some sort. Don't know what it means. Maybe it's like tag. Somebody has to cover their face up. And Pippi's is covered up right now with cream pie. She stuck out her tongue and licked away the cream. "This was indeed a dreadful accident," said she, "and all the pie is ruined now anyway, so I may as well eat it all up at once." She dug into it with the pie server, and in a few minutes the whole pie had disappeared. Pippi patted her stomach contentedly. Mrs. Settergren had gone out into the kitchen, so she knew nothing about the accident or the cream pie, but the other ladies looked very sternly at Pippi. No doubt they would have liked a little pie too. Pippi noticed that they looked very disappointed and decided to cheer them up. "Now, you mustn't feel bad about such an accident," she said comfortingly. "The main thing is that we have our health, and at a coffee party you should have a little fun." She then picked up a large sugar bowl and tipped all the lump sugar in it out of the door. "Well, my goodness," she cried. "Now look what I've done. How could I make such a mistake? I thought this was granulated sugar. Bad luck seems to follow me today." Thereupon she took a sugar spoon out of another bowl and began to sprinkle granular sugar all over the floor. "I hope you notice," she said, "that this is the kind of sugar that you sprinkle on things. So it's perfectly all right for me to do this, because why should there be the kind of sugar to sprinkle on things if somebody doesn't go and sprinkle it? That's what I would like to know. Have you ever noticed what fun it is to walk on a floor that has sugar sprinkled all over it?" she asked the ladies. "Of course, it's even more fun when you're barefoot," she added as she pulled off her shoes and her stockings. "You ought to try it too, because nothing's more fun than that, believe me." At that moment, Mrs. Settergren came in, and when she saw the sugar all over the floor, she took Pippi firmly by the arm and led her over to the sofa with Tommy and Annika. Then she went over to the ladies and invited them to have more coffee. That the cream pie had disappeared only made her happy, because she thought the ladies had liked it so much that they'd eaten it all. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika sat talking quietly on the sofa. The fire crackled on the hearth. The ladies drank their coffee, and all was quiet and peaceful once again. And as so often happens at coffee parties, the ladies began to talk about their servant problems. Apparently, they had not been able to get very good servants. This is of a different time, in a different place. I don't know. Figuring this out about the Settergrens. For they were not satisfied with them, and they had agreed that it was really better to not have any servants at all. Okay. It was much more satisfactory to do things yourself, because then at least you knew things were done right. Okay, this is a problematic party, but let's not judge this story too much right now. It's of a different time and a different place. I guess we can judge it, but we'll just keep going right now and not dig into that. Pippi sat on the sofa listening, and after all the ladies had been talking a while, she said, "Once my grandmother had a servant named Malin. She had chilblains, I don't know what that means, chilblains, on her feet, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with her. Maybe she had like a little foot injury. The only annoying thing was that as soon as company came, she would rush at them and bite their legs and bark. Oh, how she would bark. You could hear it all through the neighborhood, but it was only because she was playful. Only, of course, strangers didn't seem to understand that. The dean's wife, an elderly woman, came to see grandmother once soon after Malin first came, and when Malin came dashing at her and bit her ankle, the dean's wife screamed so loudly that it scared Malin, so that her teeth clamped together and she couldn't get them apart. There she sat, stuck to the dean's wife's ankle until Friday. And grandmother had to peel the potatoes herself, but at least it was done. She peeled so well that when she was done, there were no potatoes left, only peelings. But after that Friday, the dean's wife never came to call on grandmother again. She just could never take a joke. And poor Malin, who was always so good-natured and happy, though for that matter, she was a little touchy at times, there's no denying that. Once when grandmother poked a fork in her ear, she howled all day. Pippi looked around and smiled pleasantly. It's quite a story. Yes, that was Malin for you, she said, and twiddled her thumbs. The ladies acted as if they had heard nothing. They continued to talk. See, I wonder... We're going to find out who Malin is. Now, I'm just seeing this next sentence. Some of these women at the coffee party are not our friends. If my Rosa were only clean, said Mrs. Bergen, then maybe I could keep her, but she's such a regular pig. Say, you ought to have seen Malin, Pippi interrupted. Malin was so outrageously dirty that it was a joy to see her, grandmother said. For the longest time, grandmother thought she had a very dark complexion, but honest and true, it was nothing but dirt that would wash off. And once at a bazaar at the city hotel, she got first prize for the dirt underneath her nails. Mercy me, how dirty that girl was, said Pippi happily. Mrs. Settergren looked at her sternly. Can you imagine, said Mrs. Granberg. The other evening when Britta was going out, she borrowed my blue satin dress without even asking for it. Isn't that dreadful? Yes, indeed, said Pippi. She certainly seems to be cut from the same piece of cloth as Malin, from what you say. Grandmother had a pink undershirt that she was especially fond of, but the worst of it was that Malin liked it too. And every morning grandmother and Malin argued about who was to wear the undershirt. At last they decided that it would be fair to take turns and each wear it every other day. But imagine how tricky Malin could be. Sometimes she'd come running in when it wasn't her turn and say, No mashed turnip today, no mashed turnip today, if I can't wear the pink woolen undershirt. Well, what was grandmother to do? Mashed turnip was her favorite dish. There was nothing for her to do but give Malin the shirt. As soon as Malin got the shirt, she went out into the kitchen, as nice as could be, and began to mash the turnip so that it splashed all over the walls. There was silence for a little while, and then Miss Alexanderson said, I'm not always certain, but I strongly suspect that my Huldah steals. In fact, I've noticed that things disappear. So, just to explain what's happening, the women are having a conversation complaining about their maids, it seems. Their help in the house. Don't like this at all. But we're going to read the book. And Pippi keeps interjecting with this story about Malin, who seems to be someone that helped her grandmother, or so we think so far. So all these women are saying something about, they're complaining about the person who's supposed to be helping them in their house. And Pippi keeps jumping in with her own answers. So Miss Alexanderson says that she thinks that Huldah steals. In fact, I've noticed several things disappear. Malin, began Pippi, but Mrs. Settergren interrupted her. Children, she said decidedly, go up to the nursery immediately. Yes, but I was only going to tell that Malin stole too, said Pippi. Like a raven. Everything she could lay her hands on. She used to get up in the middle of the night and steal. Otherwise she couldn't sleep well, she said. Once she stole grandmother's piano and tucked it away in her top bureau drawer. That's like a dresser drawer, a whole piano in her bureau drawer. She was very clever with her hands, grandmother said. Tommy and Annika took hold of Pippi and pulled her out of the room and up the stairs. The lady began on the third cups of coffee, and Mrs. Settergren said, It's not that I want to complain about my Ella, but she does break the china. A red head appeared over the stair rail. Speaking of Malin, said Pippi, maybe you're wondering if she used to break any china. Well, she did. She sat apart one day a week just to break china. It was Tuesday, grandmother said. As early as 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you could hear this jewel of a maid in the kitchen breaking china. She began with the coffee cups and glasses and little things like that, and then went on to soup bowls and dinner plates, and she finished up with platters and soup tureens. I think those are like big bowls, big serving bowls. There was such a crash bang in the kitchen all morning that it was a joy to hear it, grandmother said. And if Malin had any spare time in the afternoon, she would go down to the drawing room with a little hammer and knock down the antique East Indian plates that were hanging on the walls. Grandmother bought new china every Wednesday, said Pippi, and disappeared up the stairs as quickly as a jack-in-the-box. But now Mrs. Settergren's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs, into the nursery, and up to Pippi, who had just begun to teach Tommy how to stand on his head. You must never come back here again, said Mrs. Settergren, if you can't behave any better than this. Pippi looked at her in astonishment, and her eyes slowly filled with tears. That's just what I was afraid of, she said, that I couldn't behave properly. It's no use if I try, I'll never learn. I should have stayed on the ocean. She curtsied to Mrs. Settergren and said goodbye to Tommy and Annika and went slowly down the stairs. The ladies were getting ready to go home too now. Pippi sat down in the hall near the shelf where boots were kept and watched the ladies putting on their hats and coats. Too bad you don't like your maids, she said. You should have had one like Malin. Grandmother always said there was nobody like her. Imagine, one Christmas, when Malin was going to serve a little roast pig, do you know what she did? She'd read in the cookbook that roast pig must be served with frilled paper in the ears and an apple in the mouth. But poor Malin didn't understand that it was the pig who was supposed to have the apple. You should have seen her when on Christmas Eve, with her best apron on and a big apple in her mouth. Oh, Malin, you're crazy. I like you, but you're crazy, grandmother said to her. And Malin couldn't say a word in her own defense. She could only wiggle her ears until the frilled paper rustled. To be sure, she tried to say something, but it just sounded like and of course she couldn't bite people on the leg like she usually did, and it would be a day when there was a lot of company. Poor little Malin. It wasn't a very happy Christmas Eve for her, said Pippi sadly. The ladies were now dressed and said a last goodbye to Mrs. Settergren, and Pippi ran up to her and whispered, Forgive me, because I couldn't behave myself. Goodbye. Then she put on her large hat and followed the ladies. Outside the gate, their ways parted. Pippi went towards Villa Villacula, and the ladies went in the other direction. When they had gone a little way, they heard someone panting behind them. It was Pippi who came racing back. You can imagine that grandmother mourned when she lost Malin. Just think, one Tuesday morning when Malin had time to break only about a dozen teacups, she ran away and went to sea. And grandmother had to break the china herself that day. She wasn't used to it, poor thing, and she got blisters all over her hands. She never saw Malin again, and that was a shame, because she was such an excellent maid, grandmother said. Pippi left, and the ladies hurried on, but when they had gone a couple of 100 feet, they heard Pippi, from far off, yelling at the top of her lungs, She never swept under the beds! And we will find out what happens next with Pippi, next time on Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I have been your host, Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs. I can't wait to see what happens next with Pippi. I think that Pippi was trying to teach the older women to not complain about the people who are helping you out in life, regardless of what your moral stance with that is. But the women couldn't hear it. But I'll let you figure that out on your own, because we're all in this together. Speaking of all in it together, thank you so much for watching, liking, subscribing, checking us out, doing all kinds of things with us. And I will see you next time. Bye.